On the bright afternoon of Sunday, June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry overlooked one of the largest Indian camps in history from the bluffs on the opposing side of the Little Bighorn River. Custer and his men had marched nearly 100 miles in pursuit of Sitting Bull, the leader of the camp. Custer's objective was to force Sitting Bull and his allied Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes back to the Great Sioux Reservation. However, Sitting Bull had not signed any treaty and wanted his people to continue their nomadic lifestyle, and thus was prepared to fight the Americans to defend it. Custer divided his 7th Cavalry into 4 groups. 3 companies commanded by Captain Frederick Benteen, 3 more companies commanded by Major Marcus A. Reno, 5 companies commanded by Custer, and the remainder with the pack train of ammunition and supplies. This battle between the burgeoning power of the United States and the last holdouts of the Plains Indians would shape the future of the American West for centuries to come. On April 29, 1868, the United States and parts of the Sioux Nation signed the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, establishing the borders of the Great Sioux Reservation. The treaty stipulated that the Indians would not attack American railroads or settlers, and instead would rely on government subsidies for survival. The United States government, focused on expanding its influence westward, wanted the Indians to adopt a more American lifestyle and live permanently in reservations. However, some tribes of the Sioux did not sign this treaty, and thus did not feel obligated to comply with its terms. The leader of these non-treaty Indians, Sitting Bull, did not sign the treaty and was strongly opposed to living on a reservation. In 1874, the U.S. Army sent George Custer on an expedition into the Black Hills in search of a good position for an American fort, and also in an attempt to discover rumored gold in the Black Hills. A small amount of gold was discovered, which led to an influx of American settlers in the region. The expedition was in complete violation of the Treaty of Fort Laramie and led to additional tensions with the Sioux. In 1875, the United States government ordered all non-reservation Indians to return to the reservation by January 31st, 1876, or face military action from the United States. By January 31st, the non-treaty Indians had not come back to the reservation, so America geared up for battle. Throughout the spring of 1876, the U.S. Army devised a plan to force the non-treaty Indians onto the Great Sioux Reservation. This plan would consist of General George Crook marching up from Fort Fetterman in the Wyoming Territory with 1,000 men. Colonel John Gibbon would move east from Fort Ellis along the Yellowstone River with 450 men, and General Alfred Terry would march west from Fort Lincoln in the Dakota Territory with 879 men, largely made up of the 7th Cavalry under command of Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. It was expected that any of these 3 forces could easily handle Sitting Bull and his estimated 800 to 1,500 warriors if they encountered them. Furthermore, it was expected that if one of these groups found the camp without the other 2, they would still attack it, as the Indians were infinitely more mobile than the Americans and their movement patterns were extremely unpredictable. On June 4th, a Sundance ceremony was held in the Deer Medicine Rocks. Sitting Bull received a vision of United States soldiers falling into his camp, and a great victory over the Bluecoats was prophesied. On June 10th, Major Marcus A. Reno and 6 companies of the 7th Cavalry were detached on a 10-day reconnaissance of the area between the Powder River and Tongue River to help locate Sitting Bull's camp. On June 17th, Crook's column was attacked around 10 a.m. by Lakota and Cheyenne, led by Crazy Horse along the Rosebud River. The Battle of the Rosebud would result in a slight Lakota victory, and would force General Crook to retreat and wait for reinforcements. That same day, Major Reno returned from his scouting mission and had reported to General Terry that he he discovered abandoned Lakota villages up the Rosebud Valley. So on June 22nd, Custer was detached with 12 companies of the 7th Cavalry with orders to march up the Rosebud Creek in pursuit of Crazy Horse. Custer and his men were expected to attack the Indian camp, which would cause the Indians to flee towards Terry and Gibbon's now united force, trapping the Lakota and forcing a surrender. On the morning of June 25th, Custer's scouts had finally spotted the village. They estimated that there were around 8,000 inhabitants, with a fighting force between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors. Custer initially planned to make a surprise attack the morning of the 26th, but his scouts alerted him that Custer's presence had been detected by the Lakota. Given all of this information, Custer decided that he must attack immediately, as he feared that the Lakota would be able to flee from any American army and remain off the reservation. The Indian camp was based on a flat plain at the center of the Little Bighorn River. On the eastern side of the river were steep, uneven bluffs. The Americans formed a two-pronged attack, with Major Marcus A. Reno attacking the south of the Indian camp, and Custer moving along the bluffs to attack the northern side of the camp. Captain Frederick Benteen would be in reserve to support either prongs of the attack. Major Marcus A. Reno crossed the Little Bighorn at around 3 p.m. and charged towards the village. Reno was unaware of the size or capability of the village, as his sight of the village was obscured by trees at a bend in the Little Bighorn River. Once Reno had passed this bend, he realized the full size of the village and suspected a trap. Reno rode forward and ordered his troops to dismount and form a skirmish line and fire into the village, indiscriminately hitting civilians and soldiers alike. After 20 minutes of firing, Reno had only taken one casualty, but an Indian force had formed in a protected area and launched an attack primarily on the left of Reno's line, forcing Reno's detachment to retreat back to a forested bend in the Little Bighorn River. However, the Indian barrage continued, and Reno's scout, Bloody Knife, was shot in the head, splattering his brains into Reno's face. Reno, understandably, was deeply shaken by this, and ordered his men to mount, dismount, and mount again. He then said, "All those who want to make their escape, follow me," and led an extremely disorderly retreat across the river, condemning his wounded to their death. During this retreat, many men were picked off as Indians fired at them while they crossed the river. Reno and his remaining men scurried up the 8-foot-tall bluffs and made it to a defensible position. Moments later, Benteen joined up with Reno and his now extremely shaken men. Benteen had been on a scouting mission when he received a message from Custer telling him, "Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs, P.S. bring packs." Benteen had no idea what this meant, but inferred that Custer was in battle. However, Reno would not move his forces until the packs arrived, as the baggage train was lagging behind Benteen. Reno, being the superior officer of the sector, had the power to overrule Benteen, who wanted to give aid to Custer as quickly as possible. The Indians, who were previously fighting the remainder of Reno's men, moved downstream towards Custer's detachment. It was around this time that firing from downstream was heard from the soldiers on Reno Hill, making it clear to the soldiers that Custer had been engaged somewhere downriver, but it was unclear where. Reno decided not to concern himself with the defense on the hill and instead went down the bluff to locate the body of one of his subordinates. While Reno descended the bluff, Benteen organized a defense on the hill. Captain Thomas Weir, disheartened by both of his commanders' lack of urgency, disobeyed orders and led his D company out onto the bluffs to assist Custer. This inspired other soldiers on the hill and eventually Benteen to ride out after Weir. Captain Weir reached the northern point of the bluffs and could see a smoky battle about 4 miles away. Warriors can be seen firing at objects on the ground. The Americans at this point think that Custer had been driven off by the Indians. The Indians, now done with the northern battle, drifted back towards Weir and Benteen and began skirmishing with them along the bluff. Benteen withdrew his extended forces and made it back to Reno Hill, only losing one man. The force on Reno Hill would defend themselves from Indian fire until sundown. The next day, the Indians returned and tried to push their advantage from the southern end of the hill. But with the high ground and 300 men, Reno and Benteen were able to defend the hill, receiving few casualties. The Indian camp packed up and moved further down the valley after an unsuccessful assault on Reno Hill, marking the end of the Battle of Little Bighorn. What happened to Custer's detachment is largely conjecture, as much of the information is based off secondhand sources and is highly debated to this day. Custer, during Reno's battle, was moving up the bluffs along the northern side of the Little Bighorn River. He saw Reno effectively holding off the Indians at the first part of Reno's battle, and continued to move north in an attempt to capture non-combatants in order to have a bargaining chip against the Indians. From here, Custer sends 3 companies under Captain Miles Keogh to Loose Ridge to act as a marker for Benteen's arriving troops. Custer would move with Captain George Yates down Medicine Tail Coulee towards the Little Bighorn River. When they arrived, Custer noticed that the village was completely deserted, except for small amounts of Indian warriors. Company L, under James Calhoun, fired at the Indian warriors guarding the camp by the river. Due to this, Custer decided not to cross the river and instead to reunite with Captain Keogh and move north to capture non-combatants. Custer would again keep Captain Keogh atop Calhoun Hill, while Custer and Captain Yates, along with their troops, would try to locate a place to cross the river and capture the non-combatants. While Custer moved towards the Little Bighorn, the group of Indians who had fought against Reno crossed the river and approached the troops left on top of Calhoun Hill. When Custer moved towards the Little Bighorn, he could see thousands of non-combatants fleeing the village. There were far too many to try and capture them with the small force he had, so he decided to move his forces up to Cemetery Ridge and wait for Benteen to arrive. Once Benteen would arrive, Custer would have enough men to capture the majority of the non-combatants. However, as large numbers of Indian warriors crept up Calhoun Coulee, Keogh sent Company C out of the reserve into Calhoun Coulee to defend his right flank. However, Company C's position broke the range of Keogh's warriors. The Indians then formed a counterattack to Company C's skirmish line and pressed their attack. With no assistance from Captain Keogh's troops, Company C was forced to flee on foot to Calhoun Ridge. However, the attack smashed Company C and wiped out over half of their forces. James Calhoun decided to shift his skirmish line to the west to help the remainder of Company C. However, this new skirmish line did not defend against the Indians positioned to the south. These warriors moved up and fired on the skirmish line. At the same time, the Indians coming from the west pushed up on the American line, forcing its collapse. The Americans were unable to reform their line. Company E on Cemetery Ridge was attacked by a group of Cheyenne warriors, which slashed Company E's skirmish line in half. By this point, Captain Keogh and his remaining forces were now surrounded on 3 sides. Many notable warriors, including Crazy Horse, now collapsed on the remaining American forces, plunging them into chaos. The few remaining American soldiers attempted to flee across Battle Ridge, but were continuously chipped away. Custer, by this point, could see that something big was going on across Battle Ridge, and Custer moved his men up to Last Stand Hill. Custer formed his men up into 2 lines. As the remainder of Keogh's men tried to reach Last Stand Hill, they were completely cut down. The Indian warriors now surrounded Custer and his forces, and as there was little cover on the hill, Custer was forced to shoot down his horses for cover. With Custer's remaining horses, he sent riders off the hill to try and drive away massing Indian warriors, and they would then return to the hill. However, these riders were converged on and were killed. At this point, Custer and his men were completely alone on top of Last Stand Hill. With no means of escape, they were thinned out first with gun and arrow fire, and then were overwhelmed by Indians attacking with axes and clubs. By 5:50 p.m., the battle was completely over. In total, Custer's detachment lost all 210 men with it, and the entire American force at the Battle of the Little Bighorn lost 268 men. Unsuspectedly, the Indians only lost approximately 50 warriors, marking a shockingly unsuspected defeat of the American force. The surviving force under Major Reno was unaware of what had happened to Custer by the end of June 26th. On June 27th, the combined force of Terry and Gibbon arrived on the battlefield. They informed Reno's men of what had happened to Custer and his forces. The surviving soldiers were genuinely shocked that Custer was defeated, as they never for a second thought that it was possible for them to lose to an Indian force. Although Sitting Bull and his forces stunned the Americans, the victory ended up costing them dearly. Custer's death served as a rallying point against the Indians, and within a year, the majority of the warriors from the Battle of the Little Bighorn had surrendered and were confined to reservations. Sitting Bull would end up escaping to Canada, where he would remain in exile for a few years. Crazy Horse surrendered on May 6, 1877, and was confined to Pine Ridge Reservation. After a rumor got out that Crazy Horse was attempting to escape the reservation, American soldiers attempted to arrest him, and in a struggle, Crazy Horse was stabbed and died. Indian resistance would continue against America until the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890.